Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Brendan Burns.
Yes, I'd like to speak to Part 3 of this bill. This is the part of the bill which establishes, firstly, a process for moratoriums being imposed in parts of Canterbury, and then moves into the area of water conservation areas. I want to say, firstly, that there's support for the idea of moratoriums, for me at least, because they are a mechanism which can address issues of water shortage in red-zoned areas around Canterbury. And there are a number, most particularly concentrated around the Selwyn district. The past history of this is that Environment Canterbury has, over the last few years, started to say no to more water allocations in such areas. And it's been a frustrating period for ECAM because at times commissioners they have appointed have heard the arguments of people with capacity to buy the science and the law to push an argument which says even in a red-zoned area there should be more capacity for more water to be allocated. And even at times the Environment Court has overturned ECAN decisions on such matters. So moratoriums would be useful in that respect, but there's an enormous caveat on all of that, and that is this, that when people have had access to water and want to expand, and in the past have been able to expand by seeking more water, they will obviously not be too enthused about a moratorium being imposed in a particular area. And I look, for example, at the Synlait Dairy Company based in Dunsandel. It's started just in the last couple of years, producing milk powder for export. It has already plans to quintuple production. It took an idea to the share market last year for a share float. It didn't go at all well. It didn't go at all well, actually. And a former member opposite's on the board of that organisation, as members opposite would well know. So where is it going to go next for its money? Well, one of the suggestions might be it might come back to the Chinese offer for investment in New Zealand's dairy infrastructure. Put that to one side. The point is that moratoriums are a useful exercise, but they will, I'm sure, at times lead to more demand for water if there is a wish for expansion, and that could indeed put more pressure back on new allocations. Now, going back to the original premise, this bill is around enshrining the wish, as stated by the government, for rapid new water allocation. Water projects on the ground, in place, next year in Canterbury. That's a statement of fact from the Prime Minister. The problem around that is the environmental constraints to ensure new water is allocated in a way which gives back some of the water quality that Canterbury has lost over the last time. That is the balance that we are wanting to see. That is, moratoria if you wish, are a mechanism which can assist, but it's got to be part of an entire balanced process. And if moratoria go in place and lead to rapid decisions about new allocation or assist that process, it raises enormous questions about where are the checks and balances in this legislation or anything forthcoming which will put new environmental constraints upon those who get new water. It's simply not there in the bill. The bill is also in this clause dealing with the issue of water conservation orders. These are mechanisms to protect some of the great waterways of our country. They're in place in Canterbury, on the Rakaia, on the Huranui, and I think from memory on the Rangitata, though I'd stand corrected on that. Perhaps the local member might assist. The Huranui is the last of the Canterbury rivers, which is effectively untapped from lake through to the sea. The Environment Court was due in a month's time to consider this issue, and that's an appropriate process. There are a whole range of wishes around the Environment Court decision. Obviously, people with a strong conservation ethic say leave the Huranui entirely alone. There are those of the farming community who want to see the south bank of it dammed and used for irrigation. The point is, these decisions need to go through a process. They need the checks and balances upon them. They did not need rapid allocations made because the long-term, Mr. Chair, the long-term consequences of rapid allocation will see, without the environmental checks and balances put in place, more deterioration of our waterways. And there are real concerns that it's good to acknowledge in this part of the bill 2 references to the Canterbury Water Management Strategy, both in reference to introducing moratoria and in reference to water conservation orders. There is a requirement that the Environment Canterbury Commissioners do consider the principles of the Canterbury Water Management Strategy. The problem still comes with it's just taking note of. There's no requirement to implement it, and this strategy, which has been drawn up over the last 3 years, which has been patiently negotiated for the future of Canterbury, which had a table which included representatives of fish and game, forest and bird, federated farmers, the irrigators, Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, Ngāi Tahu, the councils. All of those parties patiently negotiated the strategy, and it embodies at its first principle conservation, because there is an acknowledgement from those parties, and I note again, federated farmers and irrigators are part of that water management strategy. And the first principle was the environment, followed by customary uses, community supplies and stock water. Those are the first order priority considerations. That's right. And the second order priority was around irrigation, electricity generation, recreation, tourism and amenity. And it was envisaged that these principles would be worked through by the local community with Environment Canterbury to try and ensure that they were upheld. But what this bill does is say goodbye to that collective approach, goodbye to Environment Canterbury, which was the driving force behind this strategy, and the introduction of commissioners installed by the government for a 3.5-year period, to implement an agenda which is really the government's agenda, and it's explicit around rapid water allocation. I come back to the questions around the clauses in this bill relating to moratoria. I personally, I will speak on behalf of myself, support moratoria as a mechanism. But you cannot believe that moratoria will deliver on their own. There are problems around the build-up that occurs, and we saw that in Marlborough with 2 moratoria imposed on the issuing of further licences for marine farms. And all it created was a huge backlog of floodwater when the moratoria were lifted. You've got to have in place the mechanisms to ensure that the issues are addressed, and they've got to be addressed across the divide of both the environmental and the economic issues. You cannot have one superimposed over the top. In Canterbury, you have lost the capacity to swim safely in a lowland stream. That's something that I think every member of this House would at least in theory uphold as a principle, a God-given right that we have as New Zealanders to take our children and our grandchildren to the streams, to the rivers, and know they can safely swim. And even in the rivers of Canterbury now, the bigger waterways, it is not safe at times to swim in those rivers. In places like the Ashley and the electorate of the member for Kaikoura, and he should be noting this very carefully, it is not safe to take your dog to the Ashley because it's quite likely the dog would get cyanobacteria and die as a result of blue-green algae. And I note that's the theme that the National Party picks up in terms of environmental issues. It's got a blue-green caucus, and it's toxic. Blue-green algae is toxic. The worst known toxin known through the algae family is blue-green. And I also would note that when you mix blue and green, you get brown. That's an outcome that's in prospect with this bill, because it's not got the environmental checks in place. It is not delivering for Canterbury. It is simply enshrining the government's agenda, and that is not appropriate. It is not acceptable. The government must put in place, if it's going to push this bill through under urgency, here in the Parliament at 1:45 in the afternoon, it must give, alongside this, new environmental strengthening protections which make sure that water is